In the pale and muted dawn, when the mist still clung to the lowlands and the skeletal branches of ancient oaks reached like fingers toward a sky too vast to comprehend, the roads of early colonial America unfurled like ribbons of uncertainty. These were not paved roads, nor even entirely trodden paths, but more often faint lines pressed into the earth by the slow passage of carts, horses, and the occasional solitary footfall. The world itself seemed suspended in a delicate balance between light and shadow, and through it wandered figures like ghosts, moving with purpose yet haunted by the ineffable weight of distance and solitude. Among these figures, the traveling salesman occupied a strange and singular existence, a life of perpetual motion, carrying not only goods in leather-bound trunks and woven baskets but also the strange, quiet hope of connection in a world that seemed vast, untamed, and indifferent. The early morning air carried scents that were at once familiar and alien, the dampness of soil, the tang of smoke from distant hearths, the faint perfume of wildflowers daring to bloom in places where no one would pause long enough to notice. The traveling salesman inhaled these scents deeply, for they were markers of the living world, reminders that he had not yet been swallowed by the endless expanse of wilderness. His wagon creaked beneath the weight of carefully stacked merchandise, bolts of cloth dyed in muted blues and ochres, small iron tools glinting in the dim light, and jars of powders and tinctures whose uses were as mysterious to him as the faces that would eventually receive them. Each item represented both labor and promise, the tangible threads that tied him to a civilization that was simultaneously emerging and fragile, held together by the tenuous bonds of commerce, trust, and shared necessity. To travel in these times was to embrace a rhythm dictated not by clocks but by the sun, by the seasons, by the unpredictable temper of weather and human temperament alike. A single morning could bring a brilliant, almost cruel clarity, the sky a perfect blue that left no shadow unexamined, while the afternoon could descend into rain and fog so dense it seemed to swallow the world whole. In these moments, the salesman's mind often wandered, slipping into the quietude of reflection that only loneliness on the road can induce. He thought of towns he had left behind, of faces that had blurred with distance, and of roads yet untraveled, snaking into forests that held the quiet menace of unknown creatures, perhaps wild, perhaps merely imagined, born of isolation and the mind's natural yearning for narrative in the face of emptiness. Every village, every homestead he approached was a microcosm of a fragile and precarious society. Wooden houses, some freshly hewn, others weathered to a dull gray by sun, wind, and snow, lined narrow streets that carried the faint clatter of human life. Smoke spiraled from chimneys, curling like spirits ascending into the uncertain sky. Children ran barefoot, their laughter piercing the stillness in bursts of warmth and energy, while elders sat on rough benches, eyes scanning the horizon, ever wary of strangers who might arrive with goods, news, or trouble. The traveling salesman's presence was a quiet disruption to this rhythm, his arrival heralded by the soft jingle of bells, the rolling of wheels over uneven earth, and the subtle tension that accompanies the unknown. Merchants and farmers alike measured him not only by the goods he carried but by the character that could not be seen, the weight of experience and integrity that seemed to settle invisibly around him, as essential as the products he offered. Nightfall, however, brought a different kind of intimacy with the land. Beneath a sky thick with stars and occasionally streaked by the pale, wandering light of the moon, the roads became a study in silence and shadow. The salesman would unhitch his horse, inspect the harnesses, and set about the necessary tasks that made survival possible: a small fire for warmth, a tin cup of watered-down spirits to quiet the mind, and a careful arrangement of goods to ensure nothing was lost or damaged before morning. The night was long, and in its hours, thoughts returned in quiet waves. He considered the faces of those he had met, sometimes welcoming, sometimes suspicious. He imagined the stories behind each home he passed, the secret conversations by candlelight, the fears that whispered through drafty halls, the small rebellions and fleeting joys that made life feel like something larger than the earth beneath his feet. There was a peculiar intimacy to being a witness of all this, to moving unseen through spaces that were both private and public, sacred and ordinary. The salesman existed in a liminal zone, neither fully of the places he visited nor entirely apart from them. He was a thread woven into the fabric of colonial life, a transient presence whose touch could alter the texture of existence, however slightly. And yet, there was always an underlying unease, the subtle sensation that the land itself was conscious of him, that the forests, rivers, and hills carried memories older than any man, and that in traversing them, he was partaking in a ritual older than commerce, older than settlement. Each creaking tree, each whispering wind, seemed to speak in tones that were felt rather than heard, conveying a sense of watchfulness, of expectation, and, at times, of quiet judgment. The practice of selling, in such circumstances, was as much about observation as persuasion. The salesman learned to read the flicker of an eye, the subtle hesitation in a handshake, the inflection of a voice softened by humility or sharpened by pride. He learned patience, the ability to linger in silence, to allow the hum of life to fill the spaces between words. And in these moments, he often discovered truths that could not be sold, that were intangible yet fundamental, the weight of loneliness that each human bore, the fragile hope that clung to small pleasures, the strange comfort of shared recognition that comes when a stranger and a resident meet and acknowledge each other without need for words. The road itself was a teacher. Potholes, hidden routes, sudden rains, and wandering livestock provided lessons in caution, persistence, and adaptability. Every journey demanded attention not only to the immediate but to the anticipated, to the hazards unseen and the opportunities yet unfurled. A broken wheel, a spooked horse, an approaching storm could alter plans in moments, and the traveler's mind had to accommodate both pragmatism and imagination, foresight and improvisation. There was a rhythm to these movements, a cadence in which the physical exertion mirrored the mental discipline, guiding the wagon, tending the animals, marking distances in the mind, all while observing the contours of the land and the pulse of the settlements encountered along the way. Time, in this existence, became fluid. Days melted into nights, weeks blurred into months, seasons shifted with a quiet inevitability, and yet the salesman was ever propelled forward by necessity. His was a life suspended between departure and arrival, anticipation and recollection, commerce and contemplation. Each town held its own mysteries, abandoned homesteads where the wind carried the scent of decay, markets alive with clamor and color, and darkened lanes where shadows pooled and whispered. The uncanny familiarity of these spaces made the journey hypnotic, drawing the traveler into a state where the boundaries between waking and dreaming began to waver. It was in this liminal state that the mind wandered, unbound by immediate concerns, free to dwell on the ephemera of human ambition and the eternal vastness of the land. Merchants of larger towns whispered of distant ports and grander cities, where goods could fetch higher prices and fortunes might be imagined if risk was embraced. But the solitary path of the traveling salesman remained a more intimate and haunting enterprise. Success was measured not only by coin collected but by the subtle marks left upon the communities he touched, a new tool that eased labor, a cloth that brightened a child's day, a tincture that promised relief. Each transaction was a momentary convergence, a brief acknowledgement of the human condition and the impermanence of all things. And yet, as the wagon wheels turned and the salesman's shadow lengthened along a dusty road, there was always the awareness of the larger forces at play, nature indifferent to human toil, history unfolding beyond comprehension, and the endless repetition of lives interlaced with roads, weather, and the quiet inevitability of mortality. The stage is set not only for the journey of the salesman but for the listener's immersion into a world where commerce and contemplation intertwine, where every gesture and every mile carries weight, and where the quiet unease of the early colonial landscape lingers like a soft, persistent echo. It is a world at once tangible and dreamlike, grounded in the historical realities of settlement and survival yet hovering on the edges of imagination, memory, and the subconscious. And it is along these roads, between dawn and dusk, between homes and wilderness, between hope and quiet apprehension, that the life of the traveling salesman unfolds, a life at once ordinary and extraordinary, mundane and magical, simple and profoundly unsettling. The first rays of dawn brushed the horizon with a tentative glow, spilling pale amber light over a landscape still muted by the long night. The traveling salesman stirred within the small, sparsely furnished room he had secured for the night, the thin wooden shutters filtering the light into fractured beams that danced upon the rough floorboards. Outside, the distant crow of a rooster punctuated the silence, while the soft rustling of leaves in the early breeze whispered like secrets only the world of the living could tell. In these quiet hours, he moved with careful deliberation, unhurried, as if the very act of rising must honor the slow rhythm of the land around him. His hand brushed over the worn leather of his satchel, tracing the contours of its seams, familiar now as the pulse of his own heart, before stepping lightly across the floor to gather the small preparations for the day, a wrapped loaf of bread, a water skin, and the ledger in which he meticulously recorded the names of the households he visited, the items sold, and the brief impressions of each encounter, each impression held in delicate, unspoken reverence. Outside, the morning had begun to assert itself more fully. A thin mist clung to the uneven road, winding between trees whose branches arched like cathedral ceilings, and the ground was soft with dew that soaked the hems of the salesman's coat as he stepped onto the path. He paused for a moment, inhaling deeply, the air a mixture of damp earth, distant smoke, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers that had survived the night. Every breath seemed weighted with meaning, carrying both the promise of the day and the latent uncertainty that the path might deliver. The road itself was alive in subtle ways. It responded to the passage of wheels and hooves, groaning under the weight of wagons and echoing back faint, unpredictable sounds that reminded him he was never entirely alone, even in solitude. Shadows stretched and retracted across the ground, shifting as the sun climbed, and the salesman moved within this changing tapestry with a practiced ease born of years spent navigating both wilderness and village, both human expectation and the subtle tyranny of chance. His wagon, modest yet sturdy, creaked as he hitched the horse, checking every strap, every hinge, the ritual imbued with a quiet intensity. These motions, repeated endlessly over months and years, were both necessary and meditative, grounding him in the physical world even as the mind wandered to reflections of history, commerce, and human behavior. He paused for a moment at the reins, allowing the horse to shift its weight, its flanks heaving under the rising sun, its breath mingling with the mist. There was a peculiar companionship in this shared burden of travel, a silent acknowledgement of mutual dependence. The animal carried the cargo, but the human provided direction and care, a fragile symmetry sustained across countless miles. Beyond the horse and wagon, the landscape stretched endlessly, rolling fields giving way to patches of forest, streams glinting faintly in the early light, and distant silhouettes of settlements yet untouched by the day's bustle. The road, never straight, twisted and swerved according to the land's will, and each turn brought with it the possibility of discovery, of encounter, of risk, of reward. As he began the first leg of his journey, the salesman became attuned to the subtle symphony of sound that filled the morning. The distant clatter of a blacksmith at work in a neighboring village mingled with the soft patter of hooves on packed earth. A bird took flight from the trees, its wings slicing the air with a sudden whisper, and far away, the river gurgled over stones, invisible but ever present, a steady undertone to the unfolding day. In this delicate orchestra, he felt the pulse of colonial life, the ebb and flow of human existence interwoven with the persistence of the natural world. He measured his progress not only in miles but in the encounters he anticipated, in the rhythm of road and cart, in the soft negotiation between caution and curiosity that guided every step. Every twist in the path, every dip into a hollow or ascent over a ridge, demanded attention, and yet the mind, trained through repetition and isolation, could wander simultaneously, observing, remembering, imagining, always threading through the past and present in a quiet, almost imperceptible dance. The settlements themselves appeared as punctuations upon the sprawling canvas of the land. A farm here, its fences lean and weathered, the barn door sagging on rusted hinges, a cluster of homes there, smoke rising from chimneys like fragile fingers, a small market square alive with the scent of fresh bread, the tang of iron from blacksmith's tools, and the soft hum of conversation. To the traveling salesman, each place was at once familiar and strange, a microcosm of life governed by rituals and routines both visible and invisible. He observed the subtle hierarchies, the matriarch guiding her children with quiet authority, the merchant weighing coin with practiced detachment, the laborer bending under the weight of work, each movement a testament to human resilience and the quiet negotiation between survival and aspiration. In every gesture, in every glance, he found stories unspoken, fragments of experience that would later be recorded in the ledger of memory, catalogued not only for their utility but for their intrinsic fascination, the ephemeral textures of lives lived quietly under the watchful eye of history. The salesman's inventory, meticulously arranged, offered him both a purpose and a lens through which to engage with the communities he visited. Cloth dyed in deep indigo, small iron tools, jars of tinctures, and trinkets imported from distant ports, all carried stories as complex as those of the people who would examine them, weigh their worth, and, in some cases, accept them into their own lives. The act of selling was never merely transactional, it was an exchange layered with subtle social cues, expectations, and often unarticulated judgments. A mother selecting a piece of fabric might pause to consider not only the price but the color's suitability for her children. A farmer accepting a small tool might evaluate its craftsmanship against countless others, weighing long-term utility against the promise of novelty. And through all these interactions, the traveling salesman remained an observer as much as a participant, attuned to the rhythms of decision-making, the unspoken codes of trust, and the quiet revelations that emerged from moments of human connection. Isolation, though, was never fully absent. Between settlements, the road stretched long and unyielding, bordered by forests that seemed to close in with deliberate intent. Branches clawed at the edges of the path, and shadows deepened under the trees, shifting with the movement of the sun. In these moments, the traveler felt acutely the strangeness of being a solitary human in a vast and indifferent landscape. The mind, attuned to subtle signs, imagined movements in the underbrush, the glint of eyes watching, or the echo of a footfall not his own. This uncertainty, part reality and part conjured by imagination, infused the journey with a gentle tension, a recognition that life on the road demanded not only practical skill but psychological resilience. Even in calm weather, the silence held a presence, a reminder that the world carried histories older than any village or settlement, and that the traveler moved within an order far more ancient than commerce or colonization. As hours passed, the journey unfolded in cycles of observation, interaction, and reflection. The salesman paused by streams to water his horse, noting the shimmer of sunlight across rippling water and the occasional glint of a fish beneath the surface. He navigated muddy inclines, his boots sinking into soft earth, leaving impressions that would soon vanish under the next rainfall. He encountered travelers of other sorts, a wandering preacher moving with quiet urgency, a peddler pushing a cart laden with baked goods, a family migrating toward a new homestead. Each encounter was fleeting, yet each left traces upon memory, a faint layering of human presence that intertwined with the natural environment to form a tapestry of experience, intricate and constantly shifting. Evening approached with an almost imperceptible melancholy. Shadows lengthened across fields and forests, the sky deepened into muted hues of violet and gray, and the world seemed to hold its breath as night descended. The traveling salesman found a place to camp, a small clearing bordered by trees, with access to water and a vantage over the winding road he had traversed. He tended the horse, arranged the wagon for the night, and, as the fire sputtered to life, allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. In the flickering light, he observed the interplay of flame and shadow, the tiny movements of insects and small creatures stirring near the underbrush, and the quiet, patient observation of the forest itself, as if it regarded him with interest, amusement, or perhaps indifference. These moments were meditative, allowing the mind to drift across the day's experiences, to catalog successes and setbacks, to anticipate the encounters that awaited on the morrow, and to dwell on the strange intimacy of life spent largely between sunrise and sunset, between villages and forests, between human connection and solitude. Sleep, when it came, was a gentle surrender to the rhythm of the earth and the distant murmurs of the world around him. Dreams mingled with memory and expectation, blending the familiar roads and faces with imagined landscapes, whispered conversations, and the shadowed recesses of the mind. And in the quiet of the night, beneath the stars and the protective canopy of trees, the traveling salesman rested not merely in body but in spirit, attuned to a life defined by movement, observation, and the delicate tension between the known and the unknown. The day had stretched long under a sky of shifting light, moving from the pale clarity of morning to the muted, lingering warmth of afternoon. The traveling salesman advanced along the road, the rhythmic creak of his wagon wheels and the soft stamp of hooves providing a cadence to which his mind adapted as if it were music composed by the land itself. Each mile carried him closer to settlements that he had mapped in memory and ledger alike, but even the familiar were transformed by distance, light, and the subtle changes that time and weather imposed upon them. Fields he had traversed in spring now bore the marks of summer growth, fences leaned under the pressure of wind and rain, and paths he thought known twisted in unexpected ways, reminding him of the mutable nature of the world he traversed. He moved with careful attention, noting each detail, for in these small observations lay both safety and opportunity. A crooked fence might conceal a shortcut, a distant figure might indicate a household in need, the faint scent of smoke could guide him to a resting place for the night. The first settlement of the day emerged gradually from the forest, a scattering of wooden homes and barns nestled along a central dirt thoroughfare. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, curling ribbons, and the soft hum of human activity drifted on the air, the clang of a blacksmith hammering, the low murmur of conversation, and the distant laughter of children playing along the roadside. The salesman slowed his wagon, drawing the horse to a careful halt. In these moments, the transition from solitary road to bustling settlement demanded a subtle recalibration of mind and presence. Here, he was no longer alone. His movements, gestures, and even the unspoken weight of his gaze would be observed, measured, and interpreted by those who had known no stranger for days, perhaps weeks. To arrive in a village was to enter a delicate negotiation, not of coin alone but of attention, trust, and the invisible hierarchies that structured the rhythms of domestic and communal life. He parked the wagon in the shadow of a broad oak, its leaves whispering faintly in the wind, and surveyed the settlement with practiced awareness. The blacksmith paused, glancing toward the sound of hooves and wheels, while a woman tending her garden paused mid-task, tilting her head as if assessing the day's light. Children halted their games, some hiding behind posts, peeking out with curious eyes. The salesman allowed a moment to pass, letting his presence register without intrusion. Then, he opened the wagon doors, revealing the neatly stacked array of goods, lengths of cloth in muted blues, earthy reds, and washed ochres, jars of tinctures and powders whose efficacy was often as mysterious to him as to the villagers, iron tools of varied function, polished yet humble, and small trinkets that caught the eye, glinting in the dappled sunlight. The first interaction was subtle and ritualized. A woman approached, her movements cautious, her eyes narrowing in a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The salesman inclined his head, a silent acknowledgement of her vigilance. She examined a bolt of cloth, running her fingers along its surface, lifting it toward the light to judge color and quality. He remained still, allowing her to set the pace, recognizing that the measure of a sale was not only in the exchange of coin for goods but in the delicate affirmation of trust. When she finally nodded, accepting the price he suggested, a small relief passed through him, quiet and almost imperceptible, like the soft exhale of the land itself after a long silence. The transaction completed, he recorded it mentally, noting the household and the particular nuances of the encounter, the faint hesitation before agreement, the way her gaze lingered on the iron nails, the unspoken negotiation embedded in the careful assessment of value. As the day advanced, more villagers approached, drawn by curiosity or need. Each interaction followed a rhythm, a gentle oscillation between invitation and observation. He learned the subtle cues, the tilt of a head, the narrowing of eyes, the delicate adjustment of posture, all signaling openness, resistance, or tentative interest. The children were often the most unpredictable, darting forward to touch a new toy, then retreating as quickly as they came, their laughter and whispers echoing between the buildings like a secret song. The salesman engaged in a quiet dance, offering goods without insistence, allowing desire to emerge naturally, and withdrawing when resistance became apparent. Each transaction was brief yet rich with information, revealing not only the economic realities of the household but the intricate web of social dynamics, respect for elders, rivalry among families, the quiet assertions of authority, and the subtle assertion of personality and taste. The deeper he moved into the settlement, the more he became aware of the tension beneath ordinary life. Windows framed cautious eyes, doors opened only partially, conversations faltered as strangers passed. These were not signs of hostility but of the fragility of trust in a world where news traveled slowly and rumors often carried the weight of evidence. The salesman had learned to navigate this terrain, balancing approachability with restraint, offering curiosity without intrusion, and gauging the precise moment at which a household might welcome his presence or politely decline. In these subtleties, he found a fascination beyond commerce, the quiet mechanics of human interaction, the invisible currents that shaped decisions, the ephemeral threads that connected neighbor to neighbor, stranger to community. Even as he moved among them, the edges of the settlement whispered of wilderness beyond, the looming presence of forests and fields that extended unbroken to the horizon. The contrast between cultivated spaces and untamed land was always palpable, and he felt it keenly. Within the settlement, life moved with structure and repetition, governed by toil and ritual. Outside, the natural world existed without regard for human planning, full of both opportunity and peril. This duality haunted his steps, the awareness that safety was provisional, that comfort could vanish with the shift of a weather pattern or the intrusion of an unforeseen animal or human threat. He carried this awareness lightly, as a shadow behind his consciousness, a constant, unspoken companion on every road and in every transaction. The afternoon sun waned, casting long, shifting shadows across the dirt streets and open fields. He paused at a well to offer assistance to a family drawing water, and in the exchange of a brief smile, he felt the strange intimacy of shared labor. Each gesture, each acknowledgement, carried a weight magnified by the transient nature of his presence, a day's interaction might be the only contact the household had with the wider world for weeks, perhaps months. The awareness of impermanence infused every gesture with significance. Even the simplest sale, an iron tool, a length of cloth, a jar of tincture, became a symbol of connectivity, a brief bridge across isolation, a tangible manifestation of human concern reaching across distance and time. Yet, beneath the warmth of these interactions, there lingered a subtle disquiet. The woods surrounding the settlement seemed to hold a persistent vigilance, as though aware of his movements, and occasionally, glimpses of figures moving beyond cultivated fields, hunters, wanderers, or perhaps merely shadows cast by windswept branches, reminded him that observation was not his alone. The human mind, prone to projection and imagination, filled these peripheral glimpses with narrative, and he often allowed himself to drift into contemplations of who might inhabit those spaces unseen, what histories might be embedded in the soil and trees, and what forces, natural or otherwise, influenced the subtle ebb and flow of life around him. The sensation was neither threatening nor comforting, but it instilled a meditative awareness, sharpening his senses even as it invited the mind to wander into quiet speculation, blending history, instinct, and imagination into a continuous undercurrent of attention. As evening approached, he prepared to depart, settling accounts and carefully arranging his remaining inventory for the journey ahead. The villagers watched with muted curiosity, some offering small gestures of farewell, others returning to their routines without acknowledgement. The salesman noted these departures, cataloging the subtleties of response, the slight bow, the tentative smile, the lingering glance. Each left an imprint, subtle yet enduring, on the ledger of experience he carried in his mind. The day's work, though outwardly simple, demanded a full engagement of perception, patience, and interpretation. Each interaction, no matter how brief, required observation, empathy, and the ability to read the unspoken language of commerce and community. By the time he left the settlement, twilight had begun to blur the boundaries of land and sky, the horizon softened into a wash of muted violet and gray. The road ahead was uncertain, yet he moved with a quiet confidence born of repetition and attentiveness. Every mile carried lessons, every encounter left traces, and every pause offered an opportunity to reflect on the intricate weave of human and natural forces that defined existence in these early colonial years. Shadows lengthened along the path, the wind whispered through trees, and the faint sound of nocturnal creatures began to stir in the underbrush. In this dimming light, the salesman felt the presence of both past and future, the infinite stretch of time folded into the finite day, and the strange, comforting rhythm of a life spent traversing both the known and the unknowable. Night fell fully as he found a small clearing for rest, the fire crackling and casting flickering patterns on the wagon and surrounding trees. He tended the horse, organized the remaining goods, and allowed the mind to wander as the darkness settled around him. In these hours, memory and anticipation intertwined, the events of the day replayed with quiet attention, and the possibilities of the next day unfolded in shadowed suggestion. Sleep came slowly, a gentle surrender to the weight of miles traveled and lessons absorbed, the mind drifting between awareness and dream, between commerce and contemplation, between the familiar warmth of human interaction and the endless, indifferent vastness of the world through which he moved. The road stretched endlessly, winding through the undulating countryside like a faint scar upon the earth, and the traveling salesman moved along it with a deliberate, unhurried pace, guided by habit as much as by the needs of the day. Between settlements, the world assumed a different quality, one not marked by the social rhythms of human habitation but by the subtler, slower pulse of nature and weather, of earth and sky, of time measured in shadow and light rather than bells or spoken words. The forest, dense and unyielding, pressed against the edges of the path, the branches arching overhead in a cathedral of muted green, allowing shafts of sunlight to pierce intermittently, creating patterns that shifted with every step, every turn of the wagon wheels. There was a meditative cadence to this passage, the gentle sway of the cart, the occasional snort of the horse, the rhythmic scrape of iron-shod wheels over uneven ground, all coalescing into a hypnotic, almost musical backdrop against which thought and observation could unfold. Isolation between settlements was both a burden and a gift. The traveler became hyper-aware of the smallest details, the shape of clouds that might hint at coming storms, the faint sound of running water hidden in gullies, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Each observation was recorded in the mind as carefully as any sale ledger, catalogued not only for practical utility but for the quiet, almost obsessive, understanding of the landscape itself. A misplaced branch, a fresh animal track, or a distant plume of smoke could signal opportunity or danger. The smallest change in the rhythm of wind or the pattern of shadows could foretell the shift of weather, the proximity of other travelers, or the approach of night. The salesman's senses, honed by repetition and experience, absorbed these signals, transforming awareness into instinct, and instinct into action. The day advanced slowly, marked by intermittent pauses to tend the horse, to inspect the wagon, or to consult the leather-bound journal in which he recorded distances, observations, and subtle details of the path. These pauses became meditative rituals, moments of reflection in which he could survey the landscape and let the mind drift, connecting threads between one encounter and the next, 1 mile and the next, one village and the next. Sometimes, he lingered at the edge of a stream, the water clear and cold, flowing over rocks smoothed by centuries of passage, the sound a quiet, insistent murmur that seemed to speak directly to him. Here, he allowed himself to rest both body and thought, observing the dance of light upon ripples, the delicate movements of insects skimming the surface, the occasional ripple caused by an unseen fish beneath. Such moments offered respite, yet also reinforced the solitude of the road. The world was alive, yet apart from human concern, and he was but a small, fleeting presence within it. The psychological texture of this solitude was complex. Loneliness was neither purely painful nor purely comforting but occupied a liminal space that allowed for heightened perception and quiet contemplation. He could listen to the rhythm of his own breathing, the soft creak of the wagon, the distant calls of birds, and feel the subtle vibration of earth under hoof. This attention to the minute details of existence became both a survival strategy and a form of meditation. The mind, left largely to its own devices, often wandered into stories, of the people he had met, of those he might encounter, of villages long abandoned, of travelers lost to the forest, of dangers imagined and real. These reflections were tinged with a peculiar, sometimes unsettling, awareness that the world was vast and indifferent, that human endeavor was fragile, and that the persistence of life was as much a product of patience and observation as of industry or skill. Encounters between settlements were rare but significant. Occasionally, he met another traveler, a peddler carrying baked goods, a preacher on horseback, or a family moving to new land. Such meetings were brief, conducted with nods, measured words, and occasional shared advice about the roads ahead. Even these fleeting exchanges were infused with subtle social calculus, for in these isolated stretches, trust had weight, and caution was essential. A misjudged interaction could cost not only time and resources but safety. The salesman moved through these interactions with the same patient observation he employed in settlements, noticing posture, tone, gaze, and timing, weaving these cues into the continuous awareness that guided his every step. The land itself was a teacher, unyielding and inscrutable. Streams could swell unexpectedly with rainfall, turning gentle crossings into treacherous challenges. Hills could hide loose soil and roots that threatened to unseat wheels or horses. Sudden gusts of wind could carry branches or debris across the path. Every mile demanded constant vigilance, every decision, where to pause, how to navigate, when to press onward, required a balance of instinct, observation, and experience. And yet, within this vigilance, there was a rhythm that lulled the mind into a state of heightened awareness combined with almost dreamlike reflection, a liminal state in which danger and discovery, effort and repose, intertwined seamlessly. The sense of time was altered on these stretches. Hours dissolved into one another, marked by the shifting light, the arc of the sun, the changing sounds of the forest, and the occasional distant sign of human habitation. In these intervals, the salesman's thoughts became more fluid, flowing like the streams that crossed his path. Memories of past sales, faces, and villages intertwined with imaginings of those yet to come. He reflected on the fragile interdependence of human communities and the land that sustained them, noting how commerce was not merely an economic act but a subtle, almost sacred negotiation with nature, with society, and with the self. Every transaction, every pause, every observation contributed to an expanding understanding of his place in the world, a perspective both intimate and unsettling in its breadth. Evening approached as the shadows lengthened, folding the road into a tapestry of muted colors and soft forms. The salesman's pace slowed, his eyes tracing the subtle contours of the land, the glimmer of water, the sway of trees, and the distant silhouette of a hill where the sun would soon disappear. The sense of isolation intensified in these hours, carrying with it both calm and unease. The quiet of approaching night brought reflection, but also the faint, almost imperceptible sense of being observed, whether by the wilderness itself or by the hidden presence of other travelers, animals, or spirits imagined by the mind's natural tendency toward narrative. This tension, ever present yet unobtrusive, sharpened the senses and lent a depth to perception that was absent in the structured bustle of settlements. Campsites were chosen with deliberate care. The salesman sought clearings that offered vantage points, access to water, and some measure of concealment. Once the wagon was secured and the horse tended, he would sit near the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows that danced across trees and ground alike. Here, he allowed himself to reflect on the day, cataloging encounters, estimating distances traveled, and noting the subtle changes in terrain that might influence future journeys. These moments of pause were meditative, allowing both the body and mind to rest, while also nurturing the awareness of the vast, complex world that stretched far beyond immediate perception. Night on the road was an entity unto itself. Darkness deepened the forest, muffling sound and shaping the familiar into forms both comforting and strange. The firelight offered a fragile sphere of warmth and illumination, yet beyond its reach, the shadows seemed to shift with intention, weaving between the trees, pooling along the ground, and blending into the darkness of the unknown. The salesman sat quietly, listening to the subtle chorus of nocturnal life, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the distant calls of owls, the whisper of wind through branches. Each sound was catalogued, interpreted, and woven into the mental map of his surroundings, yet each also carried the weight of mystery, hinting at the hidden depths and unseen presences that populated the wilderness. As sleep approached, the mind oscillated between memory and speculation, between the tangible and the imagined. Dreams were mingled with recollection, a village half remembered, a transaction long completed, a path partially obscured by trees, an animal crossing at twilight. These images flowed together with the rhythm of the road, creating a tapestry of consciousness that was at once calming and disquieting, grounding and ethereal. The traveling salesman rested not merely in body but in the ongoing awareness that each day's journey was a delicate negotiation between permanence and transience, solitude and connection, effort and surrender. In this, the life between villages assumed a unique character, a constant interplay between vigilance and reflection, isolation and observation, reality and the imagined. The salesman became part of the landscape, a moving presence woven into the natural and social fabric of the colonial world. He was at once observer, participant, and chronicler, aware that the road, the wilderness, and the human communities he traversed were interdependent, each shaping and responding to the other in subtle, persistent ways. And as the night deepened, enveloping the wagon, the horse, and the man himself, he drifted toward sleep, suspended between the immediacy of the day and the infinite possibilities of the road ahead, guided by the quiet rhythm of existence, the soft murmur of nature, and the enduring pulse of history beneath his feet. The day unfolded in muted tones, the sky a pale canvas streaked with faint clouds that hinted at both clarity and storm. The traveling salesman moved along the worn path, his wagon wheels pressing into soil softened by recent rains, the horse's hooves leaving imprints that would soon vanish with the next shift of weather. Each mile carried with it a silent rhythm, the gentle sway of the cart, the subtle clop of hooves, and the occasional creak of wood acting as a lullaby for his attentive mind. The road was both companion and teacher, a space of constant observation, where each turn might reveal a hidden brook, a fallen tree, or the faint traces of those who had traveled before him. In these moments, he became acutely aware of the dual nature of his existence, part observer, part participant, navigating a world that was at once familiar and unknowable. The isolation between settlements was profound, and with it came both reflection and unease. The salesman's thoughts often wandered to those he had met and those he had yet to encounter, weaving narratives around faces and gestures that existed only in memory or anticipation. He pondered the lives of farmers tending distant fields, of women and children performing daily tasks with quiet diligence, of men laboring under the sun's oppressive heat, and he imagined the histories that had brought them to these moments. Each speculation was tinged with uncertainty, a recognition that much remained unseen, unspoken, and perhaps unknowable. And yet, there was a meditative satisfaction in this awareness. To understand the world, even partially, through observation and reflection, was to connect, however fleetingly, with the vast web of life that extended beyond the edges of his perception. The natural world, in these stretches, was both ally and adversary. Streams swelled unexpectedly, creating temporary obstacles that demanded careful navigation. The wind shifted without warning, scattering debris along the path or pushing against the wagon in ways that required precise adjustment. Trees, ancient and immense, cast shadows that lengthened and shortened with the sun, shaping the landscape in subtle, sometimes disorienting ways. Even the air itself carried a weight of expectation, the faint scent of impending rain mingling with the earthy perfume of soil and vegetation. Every sensory impression became a point of focus, a detail to be catalogued and interpreted, for survival depended upon a nuanced understanding of the environment as much as skill or strength. Occasionally, the salesman encountered other travelers, each meeting a delicate dance of observation and restraint. A peddler, pushing a cart of baked goods, might nod in acknowledgement but offer no further engagement. A preacher on horseback could share a brief word of advice or warning before disappearing down a winding trail. A family moving to a new homestead might exchange fleeting smiles as they passed. These encounters, though brief, carried significance. Each interaction required assessment: the trustworthiness of strangers, the stability of animals, the reliability of roads, and the subtle cues that indicated potential opportunity or peril. Even in moments of apparent calm, the mind remained alert, parsing details, anticipating contingencies, and cataloging experience for future reference. As the sun climbed higher, the temperature shifted, and the salesman was forced to contend with the physical demands of travel. Sweat dampened the back of his coat, the horse's flanks glistened under the effort of navigating uneven terrain, his boots sank into soft soil, dragging slightly with each step. These exertions, though mundane, were intensified by the awareness that aid was distant. Should a wheel break, should a harness fail, or should the horse falter, the nearest settlement might be miles away, and the consequences could range from inconvenience to calamity. Such awareness instilled a careful, deliberate rhythm to his movements, transforming each task into both labor and meditation, each adjustment into a practice of patience and attentiveness. The psychological weight of this life, cumulative and persistent, began to emerge as the day wore on. Isolation, once a space for contemplation, became a mirror reflecting both past choices and imagined futures. Memories of villages visited, faces encountered, and transactions completed interwove with speculation about those yet to come. He considered the ephemeral nature of human attention, the fragility of trust, and the subtle hierarchies that governed interactions even in distant communities. The mind, left largely to its own devices between settlements, filled the quiet with narrative, constructing histories and futures, risks and rewards, often blending fact and conjecture until the edges of memory and imagination became difficult to distinguish. By mid-afternoon, the path led him through a dense forest, the trees towering and ancient, their roots twisting beneath the soil like the veins of the earth itself. Shadows pooled beneath the canopy, shifting with the movement of branches and the faint, filtered light of the sun. Here, the road became narrower, the wagon occasionally scraping against unseen obstacles, and the horse moved with measured care. In these moments, the forest seemed alive in ways both subtle and profound. The rustle of leaves whispered faint secrets, the distant cry of birds suggested motion beyond sight, and the soft, rhythmic hum of the environment pressed against the consciousness of the traveler. Each sound, each movement, became a note in a quiet symphony of awareness, demanding attention while also lulling the mind into reflection. Emerging from the forest, the salesman encountered a small clearing, a natural respite in which to rest, tend the horse, and inspect the wagon. He moved through these tasks with habitual precision, adjusting harnesses, checking wheels for wear, and ensuring that goods remained secure. The act of tending to these details became meditative, each motion deliberate, each pause an opportunity for reflection. He considered the journey thus far, noting the changes in landscape, the subtle shifts in weather, and the faint impressions of other travelers who had passed this way. Even the most ordinary details, patterns in the dirt, broken branches, faint animal tracks, carried meaning, adding layers to his understanding of the world he navigated and deepening his awareness of the delicate interplay between human endeavor and the larger forces of nature. As the sun declined, he continued along the winding path, mindful of the approaching night. The shadows lengthened, and the forest deepened, the familiar terrain now imbued with a sense of quiet menace. Sounds that had seemed ordinary by day, a bird's call, the rustle of leaves, the distant clatter of a stream, took on a new resonance in the growing dimness, reminding him that the wilderness was neither hostile nor friendly but simply indifferent, vast, and inscrutable. The psychological tension of this awareness, subtle and persistent, sharpened his perception, lending weight to each movement, each decision, each pause to observe and consider. Nightfall arrived with a muted finality, the sky shifting into deep indigos and muted grays, stars beginning to pierce the veil of darkness. The salesman sought a clearing with vantage and concealment, a place to rest both horse and self, and set about the familiar rituals, tending the animal, securing the wagon, and preparing a small fire whose flickering light would ward off both chill and unease. Here, in the fragile sphere of warmth and illumination, he allowed the mind to drift, cataloging the day's encounters, reflecting on decisions made, and anticipating the uncertainties of tomorrow. Shadows flickered along the ground, and the forest whispered with subtle motion, yet within this space, he found a sense of equilibrium, a recognition that isolation, vigilance, and reflection were inseparable companions on this journey. Sleep, when it came, was deep yet permeable. Dreams flowed like the winding roads, blending remembered villages, imagined encounters, and the vast, indifferent wilderness. The mind wandered along paths both familiar and uncharted, tracing the arc of days past and projecting into those yet to come. In these nocturnal reflections, he understood the dual nature of his existence, a life defined by movement and observation, by connection and solitude, by tangible commerce and intangible understanding. The road, the settlements, the wilderness, and the small, fleeting interactions of daily life were woven into a continuous fabric of experience, each thread carrying weight and meaning, each moment shaping the consciousness of the traveler in subtle, enduring ways. In these stretches between villages, the life of the traveling salesman assumed its deepest resonance. The physical demands of travel intertwined with the quiet attentiveness required for survival, and the mental space created by solitude allowed for reflection, observation, and insight. The world, expansive and indifferent, offered both challenge and contemplation, danger and meditation, uncertainty and clarity. Every mile, every sound, every shadow contributed to the ongoing rhythm of existence, shaping the traveler as much as he shaped the road behind him. And as the night deepened, enfolding him in darkness and quiet, he rested in the knowledge that his journey, while solitary and demanding, was also intimate, reflective, and connected to the larger, intricate tapestry of human and natural life. The road, which had often been a solitary artery between distant villages, began to widen as the traveling salesman approached the outskirts of a larger town. Its boundaries were marked not by a formal gate but by the subtle increase in activity, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, the rhythmic hammering of blacksmiths, and the faint clatter of carts navigating worn streets. The horses' hooves echoed differently here, striking compacted dirt rather than the soft forest floor, and the creak of wagon wheels became a minor addition to the symphony of urban noise. The town was a liminal space between the wild expanses of nature and the structured order of human settlement, a place in which commerce, community, and subtle hierarchies intersected. The salesman, seasoned by months of solitary travel, approached with the calm attentiveness that had long guided him, aware that larger settlements demanded a more nuanced reading of human behavior, social cues, and the intricate web of expectations that shaped interactions. He navigated the town streets slowly, the wagon swaying in measured rhythm, allowing both horse and mind to adjust to the denser environment. Merchants' tables lined the central thoroughfare, laden with produce, tools, textiles, and curiosities brought from distant ports. Children ran in scattered clusters, darting between adults, their laughter punctuating the low murmur of conversation. Women moved with purpose, carrying baskets of provisions or guiding younger children, while men paused periodically to exchange words, gestures, and goods. Each detail was absorbed by the salesman, catalogued mentally, and cross-referenced with the subtle knowledge of human behavior he had cultivated along his solitary journeys. The town itself was alive, its pulse measurable in motion, sound, and the faint, almost imperceptible shifts in energy that hinted at social alignments, rivalries, and alliances. The first household he visited in the town carried with it a faint, anticipatory tension. Unlike the rural villages, where curiosity and scarcity dictated interactions, towns offered a different calculus. Reputation, commerce, and social standing subtly influenced every exchange. He approached a modest home, the door ajar, revealing the muted bustle of domestic life within. A woman paused her work, her expression flickering between curiosity and polite caution. The salesman greeted her with a measured nod, his tone soft, almost musical, carrying neither insistence nor hesitancy. The transaction began as an interplay of observation. He noted her posture, the way her fingers brushed against cloth, the faint hesitation before she agreed to purchase a length of dyed fabric. Each gesture, each pause, revealed layers of meaning, and he responded with the practiced subtlety of a man attuned to the rhythms of human expectation. As the day progressed, he moved through a series of interactions, each nuanced, each demanding attention not merely to words but to what was left unsaid. In the larger town, the community was dense, and reputations carried weight. His presence as an outsider required careful negotiation. A merchant in a corner stall measured his interest with slight, deliberate movements, his eyes glinting with scrutiny and quiet challenge. A housewife questioned the quality of iron nails, turning them over, testing weight and strength, her gaze flicking occasionally toward neighbors as if seeking silent counsel. The salesman engaged with patience and attentiveness, offering information and guidance without presumption, allowing trust to form through subtle acknowledgement rather than overt persuasion. In these moments, commerce became a dance, a meditation in motion, where observation and patience held equal value to goods themselves. Between visits, the salesman paused to observe the town as a whole, noting its rhythm, its silent hierarchies, and the small, almost imperceptible tensions that threaded through daily life. The market square was a microcosm of society, elders seated in shaded corners, overseeing proceedings, laborers moving with measured urgency, their tasks marked by repetition and necessity, children darting through streets, their attention shifting with fleeting curiosity. Each person was engaged in a web of responsibilities, relationships, and expectations, and every observer, especially one as attuned as the traveling salesman, could detect the subtle signals that guided interaction. He catalogued these observations with care, understanding that each detail might inform future journeys, negotiations, and interactions in both this town and others yet to be visited. The afternoon sun shifted, casting long shadows across streets and buildings, and the salesman ventured toward the outskirts of town, where commerce was quieter, less structured, but no less significant. Here, the edges of urban life blended with the remnants of wilderness, and the interplay between human order and natural entropy became palpable. A thin line of trees and brush marked the transition, the path narrowing, the shadows deepening. The horse moved cautiously, and he followed with measured attention, noting the faint signs of past travelers, wheel ruts, footprints, broken twigs. Even in this semi-urban liminality, the natural world reminded him of its persistence, its indifference, and its subtle influence on human endeavor. An encounter at the town's apothecary revealed the layered complexity of social and commercial exchange in these larger settlements. The apothecary, a middle-aged man with precise movements and a gaze sharp as tempered steel, examined the salesman's wares, particularly the jars of tinctures and powders. He weighed their potential usefulness against cost, demand, and quality, questioning with subtle, almost surgical precision. The salesman responded in kind, offering measured explanations, occasional demonstrations, and careful attention to the man's reactions. The interaction unfolded as a silent dialogue, a negotiation not merely of goods but of trust, expertise, and shared understanding. When the transaction concluded, it left both parties with a sense of accomplishment, a quiet acknowledgement of competence and respect, and the salesman carried forward not only the coin received but the nuanced lessons embedded in the exchange. The psychological texture of these interactions was intricate. In smaller villages, gestures, tone, and reputation held sway, but in larger towns, the complexity increased: social networks, perceived expertise, and subtle postures of power shaped perception and influence. The salesman had learned to read these signals intuitively, to interpret hesitation, eye movement, and posture as indicators of openness, suspicion, or curiosity. Each encounter demanded a balance of patience and assertiveness, empathy and observation, skill and intuition. He moved through these spaces with a careful rhythm, blending the attentiveness of a scholar with the presence of a seasoned traveler, absorbing not only economic detail but the faint currents of human thought, interaction, and hierarchy that define town life. By late afternoon, the town began to quiet as laborers completed their tasks and merchants prepared to close stalls. The changing light transformed familiar spaces, lengthening shadows, softening the edges of buildings, and lending the streets a spectral quality. The salesman paused at a small inn, considering a temporary resting place, the flickering light of the setting sun reflecting off windows and casting muted patterns across the ground. Here, in the half-light, he observed the subtle shift in human behavior: families returning home, tradesmen securing tools, children calling to one another in fading voices. Even in routine acts, the rhythms of daily life carried nuance, and he absorbed them all with patient attention, cataloging them in memory alongside transactions, encounters, and fleeting observations of behavior. The evening brought an unexpected tension. Shadows deepened between buildings, and the town assumed a quiet, almost uncanny character. Small noises, footsteps, the distant clang of a gate, the rustle of a dog in an alley, resonated differently in the dimming light. The salesman noted these shifts, aware of both the practical necessity of vigilance and the psychological influence of perceived uncertainty. Darkness in larger towns carried a different weight than in rural landscapes. Structures and alleys provided both shelter and concealment, and the interplay between visibility, movement, and observation required careful attention. He moved with deliberate, unhurried steps, cataloging not only physical conditions but the faint impressions of tension, expectation, and latent observation embedded in the environment. As night fully descended, the traveling salesman secured his wagon and horse within the courtyard of the inn. Lantern light glimmered through windows, and the murmur of voices offered faint companionship. Yet even here, solitude persisted in subtle forms: brief separations from other guests, the private reflections stirred by long days of observation, and the constant awareness that tomorrow would demand renewed engagement, negotiation, and attentiveness. He organized his goods, checked the wagon, and prepared for the night, aware that sleep was both necessary and permeable, a space in which memory, speculation, and the faintly unsettling presence of absence intertwined. Sleep arrived slowly, drawing the salesman into a liminal world between consciousness and dream. The streets, the townspeople, the whisper of the wind through alleys, and the faint flicker of candlelight in distant windows all blended into a tapestry of memory and anticipation. Dreams were fragments of interactions, imagined conversations, the soft echo of footsteps along uneven streets, and the quiet rhythm of the horse and wagon moving over miles of dirt and stone. In this meditative state, he rested not only in body but in the subtle understanding of his role: observer, participant, chronicler, and traveler, navigating both the physical and psychological landscapes of early colonial life. Night had settled over the town with a muted hush, yet within its streets, traces of life persisted. Lanterns flickered behind curtained windows, dogs barked softly at distant sounds, and the occasional creak of a gate punctuated the stillness. The traveling salesman moved carefully through these dimly illuminated streets, his mind attuned to subtle shifts in light, shadow, and sound. Larger towns, unlike isolated villages, demanded a constant awareness not merely of the immediate interactions but of the intricate network of observation and judgment that threaded through human activity. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried meaning, however faint, and to navigate effectively required both patience and a quiet, almost imperceptible skill. He returned to the marketplace the following morning, now bathed in soft sunlight filtered through lingering mist. The contrast between night and day reshaped the town, transforming alleys and buildings, revealing textures previously hidden, and highlighting patterns of human behavior that were only partially discernible in dim light. He moved with the deliberate pace of one who has come to understand that each step, each pause, each observation was a negotiation, with nature, with commerce, with human psychology, and with the subtle expectations embedded in social structures. The town itself was a living entity, and he, as both outsider and participant, became part of its rhythm, attuned to its currents and subtle shifts. Interactions with merchants and townspeople required a delicate balance of patience, perception, and adaptation. A silversmith, examining a length of cloth, tested both the texture and the salesman's response, probing for expertise, honesty, and flexibility. A grocer questioned the freshness of herbs, the weight of grain, and the subtle calibration of prices against perceived value. Each engagement, no matter how ordinary, carried layers of meaning. The salesman listened as attentively to silence as to speech, noting pauses, eye contact, gestures, and the unspoken signals that dictated trust and authority. In towns, commerce was a theater of presence, where social performance and subtle influence were as essential as the goods themselves. Beyond these transactions, the psychological demands of his role deepened. Towns were microcosms of human ambition, desire, and tension, and he found himself quietly observing more than merely the tangible: alliances formed and dissolved with small gestures, reputations were reinforced or undermined through subtle social signals, unspoken hierarchies shaped interactions, even when wealth or formal authority was absent. He catalogued these observations with care, understanding that knowledge of human behavior, accumulated across encounters and settlements, could guide not only sales but survival. He noticed the faintest indications of trust or suspicion, the subtle sway of body language, the timing of speech, and the rhythm of movement, all of which informed decisions in real time and lingered in memory for future reflection. In the quieter hours, between visits to households or merchants, the salesman walked through the town's peripheries, where the built environment blended gradually with untamed spaces. Here, narrow alleys and overgrown paths hinted at the persistence of wilderness beyond human order. Shadows lengthened with each step, casting familiar shapes into unfamiliar forms. The interplay of light and darkness, of constructed order and natural entropy, created a sense both calming and slightly disquieting. He moved with a rhythm that mirrored the pulse of the town, a cadence formed through observation, repetition, and deep awareness. Each motion, each adjustment of gait or angle of attention, became part of a meditative practice, linking the physical act of travel with a sustained consciousness of place, self, and other. Occasionally, the salesman encountered moments that tested his subtlety. A household might present an ambiguous response, a merchant a veiled challenge, or a child's question a reflection of collective curiosity and caution. In these instances, he relied on practiced perception. A slight hesitation in speech could signal doubt, a diverted gaze might reveal private thought, a change in posture could indicate expectation or deference. He responded with patience, mirroring subtle gestures, offering measured explanations, and calibrating presence with precision. These interactions were transactions of trust and observation as much as of material goods, a delicate negotiation in which both parties sought equilibrium, clarity, and mutual acknowledgement. Evenings in town carried a different resonance than those between settlements. The built environment transformed as darkness deepened, narrow streets became corridors of shadow, the flicker of candlelight suggested interior life beyond immediate perception, and the familiar clamor of day gave way to quieter, layered sounds, the distant shuffle of boots on worn steps, the occasional laughter of families within homes, and the soft, almost imperceptible movement of night creatures. In this liminal space, the salesman found both caution and reflection. Awareness of the unknown, of unseen observers, and of potential disruption heightened attention while simultaneously inviting contemplation, a duality that became central to his existence. By late night, the traveler often returned to the inn or a modest rented room, preparing for sleep with careful attention to the horse, the wagon, and his remaining goods. The act of preparation became ritualized, a form of meditation in which order was restored to both the material and mental landscapes. Each item was accounted for, each interaction catalogued, and each subtle observation integrated into memory. Sleep, when it arrived, was permeable and reflective. Dreams merged fragments of towns, markets, faces, and roads into a continuous tapestry of awareness. Memory and imagination intertwined, creating scenes of hypothetical encounters, imagined negotiations, and the faint presence of those met along the journey. The salesman's awareness of human fragility and unpredictability grew with each day. He noted the delicate balance between scarcity and abundance, between trust and suspicion, and between the fleeting needs of individuals and the enduring rhythms of communal life. Observing these dynamics, he recognized that commerce was inseparable from psychology. The act of exchange carried ethical, emotional, and social weight. Decisions made in the moment, whether to insist, defer, or observe, rippled outward, affecting not only the immediate transaction but the perception of presence and trustworthiness within the larger network of the town. One afternoon, as he moved through a narrow lane behind the market square, he encountered a subtle crisis. A merchant's stall had been overturned, a horse startled, and goods scattered across the street. The small disruption drew a quiet crowd, their murmurs blending with the occasional shout and clatter. The salesman paused, observing carefully before intervening, offering assistance to calm both horse and merchant. His actions were deliberate, measured, and mindful, reinforcing both competence and discretion. Through such moments, he learned the deeper currents of social interaction, that empathy, careful judgment, and understated presence often carried more weight than overt authority, that trust could be established quietly, and that even transient influence shaped perception in ways that endured beyond immediate observation. As night approached once again, the town shifted from a space of observable activity to one of quiet tension and subtle mystery. Lanterns flickered in windows, casting shifting shadows across streets. Faint sounds of distant activity mingled with the near silence of rest, and the salesman, seated near his temporary lodgings, catalogued the day's nuances. Each observation, each interaction, each decision, contributed to the growing awareness that life in these larger settlements demanded both skill and reflection, attentiveness and patience, subtlety and presence. The road between towns might have been solitary and reflective, but towns themselves were theaters of perception, negotiation, and quiet influence, where commerce and psychology were inseparable. Sleep, when it arrived, carried fragments of town life into dreams, the flicker of lanterns, the subtle sway of figures in alleyways, the quiet scrutiny of merchants, and the faint, almost spectral presence of neighbors and strangers alike. Consciousness drifted between memory and anticipation, blending the tangible with the imagined, the familiar with the unknowable. In this liminal state, he rested within the understanding that each day's journey, each exchange, each observation, was part of a continuous rhythm of life, a meditative interplay of solitude and interaction, awareness and reflection, commerce and presence, all threaded through the intricate, subtly unsettling fabric of colonial towns and the wider world they inhabited. The road, long familiar and yet endlessly mutable, stretched ahead in muted undulations, the soft soil giving under the wagon wheels as if acknowledging the passage of countless travelers before him. The traveling salesman moved with a rhythm that had been honed by months, perhaps years, of solitary experience, his senses attuned to subtleties that most overlooked, the faint shift of wind over ridges, the glimmer of water beneath distant trees, the rustle of hidden creatures moving just beyond sight. Each detail was a fragment of understanding, a thread woven into a tapestry of perception that connected him to the landscape and, by extension, to the lives that unfolded upon it. In this liminal state, between vigilance and reflection, the journey assumed dimensions beyond commerce. It became a meditation upon survival, morality, and human presence within an indifferent world. The psychological weight of travel had accumulated slowly, imperceptibly at first, and now surfaced with a quiet insistence. Solitude, once a companion offering clarity and calm, now pressed with a subtle gravity. The mind, left to wander in stretches of forest, fields, and meadows, had begun to trace patterns not only of commerce but of morality, justice, and human fallibility. He reflected upon the small decisions made in the course of transactions, when to insist, when to defer, when to observe in silence. These choices, though trivial on the surface, carried ramifications both immediate and latent, affecting not only his material success but the perception of integrity and trustworthiness among those he met. The road had become both teacher and mirror, revealing the contours of his own mind in a light neither entirely flattering nor condemning. As he approached a particularly winding section of path flanked by dense woods, the salesman noted the faint remnants of past travelers, worn ruts in the earth, broken twigs, and footprints now softened by rain. Each trace was evidence of human endeavor, ephemeral yet persistent, and he contemplated the impermanence of such markers. Just as these paths bore witness to passage, so too did human lives leave subtle impressions upon the world, the faint echo of a voice in a village, the shifting balance of trust within a household, the ripple of reputation across communities. The thought carried with it both melancholy and acceptance. All acts, however deliberate, were fleeting, yet all contributed to the quiet architecture of lived experience. The day deepened, the sun moving toward the western horizon, and the traveling salesman paused near a small, hidden stream. He allowed the horse to drink, the gentle sound of flowing water filling the silence that had settled over the forest. In these moments, he reflected not only upon external surroundings but upon the interior landscapes that had grown increasingly complex over the months of travel. Each day's journey was no longer merely a sequence of measured miles and transactions but a meditation upon human interconnection, the subtle weight of observation, and the delicate equilibrium between autonomy and responsibility. The mind, once occupied with pragmatic concerns of goods, distance, and currency, now traced moral and psychological terrain with the same meticulous attention. Encounters, when they arose between settlements, carried heightened significance. A family moving to a distant homestead might pause to observe him, curiosity tempered by caution, and he responded with quiet attentiveness, gauging posture, tone, and eye contact. In these small interactions, he recognized the underlying currents of trust, fear, hope, and desire that defined human existence in the colonial landscape. Commerce was intertwined with ethics in ways that could not be articulated but were nonetheless palpable. A misjudged gesture, an insensitive word, or a failure to observe subtle social cues could ripple outward, leaving consequences that were imperceptible yet enduring. The traveling salesman had learned to navigate these currents with patient observation, balancing the demands of livelihood with the invisible obligations imposed by proximity and attention. As the afternoon waned, clouds gathered along the horizon, their pale gray forms shifting in quiet turbulence. The forest seemed to respond, the wind whispering through leaves, branches bending with gentle insistence, and the horse moving with instinctive caution. Storms, both literal and metaphorical, were a constant presence along the path, each brought reminders of vulnerability, unpredictability, and the limits of control. The salesman observed the sky with attentive calm, noting the direction of wind and the density of clouds, calculating potential shelter, and mentally tracing alternative routes should conditions worsen. These practical acts, however, were accompanied by deeper reflections upon human fragility and resilience, upon the small agency that persisted within a vast and indifferent world. The approach of evening marked the return of shadows, elongated and shifting, casting familiar shapes into unfamiliar contours. The path narrowed as he entered a wooded section, the forest floor dappled with fading light, each tree a sentinel of quiet patience. In these liminal spaces, the mind wandered with both wonder and subtle unease. The road became a mirror, reflecting past decisions, imagined futures, and the intricate interplay between human action and consequence. Each step demanded awareness, yet each pause invited meditation, and the interplay between movement and stillness cultivated a rhythm that was at once calming and quietly unsettling. By nightfall, the traveling salesman reached the edge of a small settlement, marked by modest dwellings, a few smoke-streaked chimneys, and the faint glow of candlelight. Unlike larger towns, this place bore the intimacy of sparse human presence. Interactions were measured, cautious, yet infused with a fragile warmth. He approached a home where he had been welcomed before, observing not only the physical space but the subtle signs of domestic rhythm. A child's laugh carried faintly from a window, a woman paused in the doorway to regard him, a man adjusted tools with careful attention. Each detail was noted with patient awareness, informing both immediate action and broader understanding of human interconnectedness. Transactions proceeded as they always had, with measured words, deliberate gestures, and an attentive calibration of presence. Yet beneath the practical purpose of trade lay subtler currents, the delicate balance of respect, trust, and ethical consideration. The salesman reflected upon the weight of these invisible threads, recognizing that commerce was inseparable from the human condition. It revealed character, forged connections, and occasionally highlighted moral ambiguity. A moment's hesitation, a choice to offer or withhold, had meaning beyond the transaction itself. It resonated within the small social ecosystem, leaving impressions that would outlast the immediate interaction. The night deepened, and the traveling salesman prepared his temporary camp. The fire, small yet persistent, cast flickering shadows that danced upon surrounding trees and buildings. In this quiet sphere, he tended horse and wagon, arranged goods for the next day, and allowed the mind to trace the intricate network of experiences, observations, and reflections accumulated over months of travel. Sleep approached with the gentle insistence of necessity, yet even in its arrival, consciousness remained lightly tethered to the faint currents of thought, the weight of solitude, the subtle influence of human interaction, the persistent hum of the natural world, and the quiet moral reckonings embedded within daily life. As he rested, dreams carried fragments of path and settlement, faces observed and imagined, transactions completed and anticipated. Each element wove together in a tapestry that was at once tangible and ephemeral, historical and meditative, real and imagined. The traveling salesman existed in a liminal space, suspended between action and reflection, between commerce and morality, between solitude and human presence. In this state, the journey itself became the meditation, a continuous rhythm of observation, adjustment, and reflection that echoed through the forests, roads, and settlements of colonial America, leaving subtle imprints upon both the world and the self. The road seemed quieter than usual, the rhythm of the wagon and horse softened by the encroaching dusk. The traveling salesman felt the subtle shift of season in the air, a faint chill carried hints of approaching winter, and the light, already muted by clouds, held the quality of a lingering twilight, suspended between day and night. The forest flanking the road had grown denser, the trees arching overhead, casting long, uneven shadows that swayed with the faint wind. Each step along the path demanded careful attention, not only for the physical act of travel but for the mental negotiation of observation and reflection that had become second nature. In these final miles, awareness was both a tool and a companion, a measure of survival, a meditation on solitude, and a reflection upon the subtle ethics of commerce and human interaction. The salesman paused occasionally to observe the faint traces of those who had traveled before him, will ruts softened by rain, footprints partially obscured by leaves, broken twigs displaced in patterns that suggested movement, but not intent. In each trace, he perceived echoes of existence, lives intersecting with the road, choices made and forgotten, effort expended, often unseen. The path itself seemed to whisper a quiet narrative, one of persistence and transience, of human endeavor measured against the vast and indifferent backdrop of nature. He felt both a part of this continuum and a fleeting observer, acutely aware of the impermanence that shadowed every step. The day was punctuated by encounters, fewer than in towns but more frequent than in the open wilderness. Travelers moving toward settlements or distant farms exchanged measured nods, a messenger on horseback passed, eyes alert, the weight of responsibility apparent even at a distance. Each encounter carried its own subtle negotiation, signals of trust, recognition, and caution intertwined in gestures as brief as a nod or glance. The salesman, ever patient and attentive, catalogued these interactions silently, reading not only the immediate behavior but the patterns they suggested, the invisible currents of human thought and expectation that moved beneath the surface of observation. By late afternoon, he reached a ridge overlooking a broad valley, its fields patterned with crops in muted shades, smoke rising from distant chimneys, and the faint glimmer of a river threading through the landscape. Here, the interplay of human cultivation and natural terrain struck him with profound clarity. The settlements below were small, fragile outposts of order within the larger, relentless flow of the world. Each village and farm represented effort, patience, negotiation, and subtle endurance, much like the path of the traveling salesman himself. He paused, allowing horse and wagon to rest, and gazed across the valley, reflecting upon the countless journeys that had led him to this vantage, months of travel through forests, streams, towns, and villages, transactions executed with care, observations catalogued in memory, solitude endured, and the quiet ethical calculations performed daily without acknowledgement or reward. The remaining journey was marked by both anticipation and introspection. As the sun dipped lower, shadows deepened across the valley, elongating hills and trees, and giving familiar contours a spectral quality. The salesman moved with deliberate caution, each step, each wheel rotation, a subtle negotiation between vigilance and contemplation. He reflected upon the nature of commerce itself, the delicate balance between necessity and desire, between trust and calculation, and between the ephemeral and enduring consequences of every transaction. The road had taught him patience, observation, and adaptability, but it had also revealed subtler lessons, the impermanence of effort, the quiet weight of moral choice, and the persistent tension between human ambition and natural order. A sudden storm gathered on the horizon, clouds swirling with muted turbulence, wind beginning to carry a chill that whispered of rain. The salesman assessed the approach with practiced attention, the direction of wind, the density of clouds, the subtle darkening of the forest canopy. Shelter was near, a small farmhouse tucked at the edge of a distant ridge, but the decision to reach it demanded balance of urgency and care. He adjusted the harnesses, spoke softly to the horse, and guided the wagon along the path with the deliberate precision that had been honed through countless similar moments. Each mile, each careful maneuver, was a meditation, the act of survival intertwined with reflection upon the impermanence of human endeavor and the subtle moral weight inherent in presence, observation, and action. As rain began to fall, fine at first, then increasing to steady drops, the world transformed. The path softened, shadows deepened, and the familiar became unfamiliar under the muted drum of precipitation. Sounds were muffled yet intensified, the slap of water against leaves, the creak of wood under wet weight, the subtle snort of the horse adjusting to slick ground. Even in discomfort, the salesman observed with quiet intensity, noting changes in terrain, movement of animals, and the subtle shifts in rhythm that demanded careful attention. Survival required both skill and mindfulness, every misstep could cascade into complication. And yet, in this heightened attentiveness, there was also an odd serenity, a deep connection to the rhythms of nature and to the continuous flow of human endeavor threaded through the colonial landscape. The farmhouse approached as the storm gathered full force. Warm light flickered from a small window, promising shelter, safety, and a temporary respite from the relentless path. The salesman guided horse and wagon into the courtyard with practiced care, noting the state of the ground, the proximity of obstacles, and the faint signs of human occupation. The occupants, startled but welcoming, offered assistance with measured courtesy, acknowledging both his arrival and the implicit understanding of shared effort and tacit social norms. Within this temporary haven, he tended horse and wagon, organized goods, and allowed the mind to drift into reflection. The day's journey had been both practical and contemplative, a merging of commerce, observation, survival, and ethical awareness into a continuous, subtle rhythm. Night settled into the farmhouse, the storm passing, leaving a quiet punctuated only by the faint drip of water and the occasional call of nocturnal creatures. The salesman prepared for sleep with ritualized care, ensuring the horse was fed and secure, inspecting the wagon, arranging goods for protection and ease of access, and cataloging the day's observations and encounters in memory. Sleep arrived slowly, carrying with it the residue of reflection, the subtle tension of solitude, and the faint echo of the road and settlements traversed. Dreams merged fragments of path, village, town, and forest into a continuous tapestry of experience, imagined conversations, transactions, landscapes, and the faintly spectral presence of those he had observed, both remembered and conjectured. In these final miles, the traveling salesman recognized the convergence of all the lessons learned along his journey. The road between settlements had taught patience, observation, and endurance. Towns had revealed the complexity of social negotiation, subtle hierarchies, and ethical responsibility. Solitary stretches had cultivated deep reflection, awareness of impermanence, and meditation upon human interconnection. Each mile, each step, each interaction had contributed to a growing understanding of both self and world. The journey itself became a mirror of existence, fragile, transient, and yet meaningful through deliberate attention, empathy, and quiet action. The night deepened, and he rested within the farmhouse, aware that the final miles to the next settlement were both practical necessity and symbolic culmination. Sleep became a bridge between reflection and anticipation, a space where memory, observation, and imagination intertwined. Dreams carried the faint echo of the path, the subtle gestures of merchants and townspeople, the rhythm of horse and wagon, and the persistent murmur of the natural world. In this state, he rested not only in body but in consciousness, attuned, reflective, and quietly aware of the delicate balance between solitude, human interconnection, and the impermanent yet enduring patterns of life along the colonial roads he traversed. The road, long traced and retraced in countless passages, stretched ahead as if endless, a ribbon of earth winding through forests, fields, and settlements, each mile imbued with the quiet memory of journeys past. The traveling salesman moved with a rhythm that had become inseparable from thought, his senses attuned to the subtleties of wind, light, shadow, and sound. The horse beneath him walked steadily, hooves pressing into soil softened by recent rains, and the wagon's gentle sway acted as both anchor and meditation. He had traversed forests dense and dark, valleys open and sunlit, towns bustling with commerce, and villages marked by the quiet resilience of simple life. Each mile had accumulated not only experience and coins but an awareness of patterns, human, natural, and moral, that extended beyond immediate perception, weaving a tapestry of consciousness both fragile and enduring. Solitude, the companion that had accompanied him from the earliest days of travel, had become a lens through which all else was perceived. In isolation, the mind had sharpened, attuned to faint cues, subtle shifts, and the invisible currents that dictated human behavior and natural response. The path between settlements was both physical and psychological, a conduit for reflection upon the self, others, and the fragile interplay of survival, observation, and morality. In quiet moments beside streams, beneath trees, or on windswept ridges, he had catalogued not only the immediate details of landscape and weather but the faint echoes of human life, the gestures, expressions, and decisions that left traces, however transient, in both memory and world. These echoes formed a continuous meditation, a quiet rhythm that paralleled the steady movement of horse and wagon along the earth. In towns, the complexity of human interaction had revealed layers previously unnoticed in the sparse solitude of rural paths. The presence of strangers, the subtle hierarchies of commerce, and the intricate web of trust and reputation required attentiveness and patience. The salesman had learned to read these cues intuitively, the tilt of a head, the cadence of speech, the slight hesitation before agreement, or the glimmer of doubt in an eye. Each transaction was not merely the exchange of goods but a delicate negotiation of presence, trust, and moral consideration. Even moments that seemed trivial carried resonance beyond immediate perception, influencing the perception of character and shaping relationships in ways imperceptible yet enduring. Observation, patience, and measured response became as essential as knowledge of merchandise or skill in travel. Yet even in towns, the rhythm of solitude persisted. The quiet reflection between encounters, the gentle pacing of horse and wagon along back roads, and the intimate awareness of temporal impermanence offered space for meditation. He understood that every day carried dualities, interaction and isolation, influence and restraint, action and reflection. Each decision, each gesture, was a thread in a broader tapestry, contributing to an ongoing dialogue between self and world. The road itself, indifferent yet responsive to careful attention, acted as teacher and mirror, revealing strengths, vulnerabilities, and the subtle moral dimensions of existence. There were moments when the line between observation and introspection blurred entirely. On ridges overlooking distant valleys, the salesman traced patterns in fields and forests, imagining the lives of those inhabiting the spaces below. Smoke rising from chimneys suggested human effort, labor, and hope. The winding course of rivers mirrored the unplanned journeys of people navigating both circumstance and choice. In these meditative moments, he contemplated the impermanence of effort and the quiet persistence of consequence. Every action, every word, every transaction, however small, was inscribed into the fabric of human and natural life, leaving faint traces that might linger unseen, shaping perception, expectation, and memory in ways subtle yet significant. Storms had come and passed along his path, bringing moments of both literal and metaphorical turbulence. Rain softened the earth, wind shifted the forest canopy, and the threat of lightning and mudslides demanded attention and care. These encounters with nature mirrored the unpredictable rhythms of human interaction. A misjudged word, a veiled expression, a hesitant gesture, could create ripples whose effects were invisible yet enduring. The salesman had learned to navigate both domains, natural and social, with patience, awareness, and subtle adjustment. Adaptation, reflection, and attentiveness became not merely tools for survival but integral elements of ethical engagement, shaping perception, memory, and the ongoing dialogue between self and world. The psychological dimension of travel had deepened over time. Solitude had initially provided clarity and calm, but gradually, it revealed layers of introspection and ethical reckoning. Each encounter, each transaction, and each stretch of road offered opportunity for reflection upon choice, morality, and consequence. He considered the weight of human presence and absence, the fleeting nature of reputation, and the persistent influence of small gestures. Even a brief smile, a pause in speech, or a careful offer of assistance could resonate beyond immediate perception, influencing trust, respect, and understanding across both space and time. The road became a laboratory of subtle human dynamics, and his consciousness a vessel for quiet observation, synthesis, and reflection. The accumulation of experience transformed the act of travel itself. Each mile was no longer merely a progression from one settlement to another but a meditation upon interconnectedness, between humans and environment, self and society, action and consequence. The forest, the fields, the rivers, and the settlements were all part of a continuous tapestry, and his passage left faint impressions as imperceptible as footprints yet resonant in meaning. He traced the movements of others along the path with patient attention, noting gestures, rhythms, and choices that revealed both individual character and collective norms. Observation became an ethical exercise as much as a practical necessity, blending survival, commerce, and reflection into a continuous meditation. As he approached familiar settlements, the sense of culmination was palpable. Villages previously visited, towns revisited, and paths retraced became markers of continuity and change. Faces once recognized returned in memory, gestures and expressions recalled with precision, and the subtle shifts of environment and circumstance registered in consciousness. These returns illuminated the impermanence of both human and natural forms. A familiar tree had shifted its branches, a house had been repaired, a path altered by rain or labor. The traveler's role was both participant and witness, cataloging continuity and change, observing both the endurance and transience of life along the colonial road. Night brought reflective quiet, a space in which the rhythm of horse and wagon slowed, and the mind wandered freely between observation, memory, and anticipation. Shadows deepened across fields and forests, and the faint glow of distant settlements punctuated the darkness. The salesman allowed thought to drift, memories of towns, villages, streams, and forests, faces observed and imagined, transactions completed with care, decisions weighed with both prudence and ethical awareness. Dreams merged the tangible with the imagined, the physical road with the mental and moral path traced through months of experience. Sleep was both restorative and reflective, a liminal space where observation, meditation, and unconscious processing intertwined. In quieter stretches, removed from immediate human observation, he contemplated the arc of the journey. The road had been teacher, mirror, and silent companion. Solitude had sharpened perception, commerce had revealed patterns of trust, influence, and ethical negotiation, towns had exposed subtle hierarchies and social rhythms, forests, streams, and ridges had offered both challenge and reflection. The interplay of observation, reflection, and ethical attention had become the core of existence on the road, creating a rhythm both hypnotic and meditative, infused with faint unease, wonder, and quiet understanding. As the final weeks of travel approached, the sense of synthesis became more pronounced. Every mile, every transaction, every interaction seemed to converge into a quiet narrative, the endurance of solitude, the persistence of observation, the subtle weight of moral choice, and the delicate interconnection of human endeavor and natural order. The traveling salesman understood, with both clarity and humility, that his journey was not merely measured in goods, coins, or miles traveled, but in the accumulation of subtle knowledge, reflective insight, and the quiet shaping of presence and influence across the landscapes he traversed. The final settlements visited carried both familiarity and novelty. Faces, homes, and streets had changed, yet patterns endured, children grew, trades shifted, smoke rose from chimneys, and fields bore the marks of labor and care. The salesman moved among these spaces with the rhythm of practiced observation, cataloging the visible and the invisible, attending to both tangible needs and subtle social currents. His presence was at once practical and contemplative, a facilitator of exchange, a witness to human patterns, and a participant in the quiet ethics of attention and trust. At the close of the journey, as he prepared to rest in a modest inn near the edge of the colonial frontier, reflection deepened into meditation. He considered the dualities that had defined life along the road, solitude and interaction, commerce and ethics, observation and reflection, permanence and impermanence. Each mile traced patterns both external and internal, each transaction reflected subtle moral negotiation, and each moment of observation revealed hidden currents of human and natural life. The road had become more than a means of livelihood. It was a vessel for understanding, a conduit for reflection, and a mirror of the complex, fragile, and enduring rhythms of existence in colonial America. Sleep descended with the soft inevitability of twilight, carrying the salesman into a liminal state between wakefulness and dreaming. In dreams, the path merged with memory, forests, towns, villages, streams, hills, and roads interwove with faces observed, decisions made, and fleeting interactions imagined. The mind, unbound by immediate necessity, traced patterns of cause and effect, trust and observation, solitude and engagement. Dreams became a quiet extension of the day's work, a synthesis of experience, reflection, and meditation. In the stillness of night, as the inn's lanterns flickered and the horse rested in its stall, the traveling salesman comprehended the essence of his journey. The miles, the commerce, the towns, and the forests were more than a series of events. They were a continuous meditation on life's fragile balance, the subtle weight of morality, and the quiet persistence of human endeavor. The road had left its imprint not only upon the landscape but upon the mind, shaping perception, insight, and ethical awareness. Solitude had honed reflection, interaction had refined judgment, observation had cultivated empathy, and travel itself had become a rhythm both hypnotic and profound, echoing long after the horse's hooves ceased their motion and the wagon wheels rested still. He awoke with the first light of dawn, aware that the road would continue, that settlements awaited, and that commerce, observation, and reflection would persist. Yet within him lingered the quiet knowledge that the journey, measured in miles, interactions, and insight, had imparted lessons deeper than currency or tangible exchange. Life along the colonial road was a meditation upon impermanence and consequence, solitude and interconnection, effort and reflection. The road, in all its shifting landscapes and human currents, had become a teacher, a mirror, and a companion, a subtle, persistent rhythm guiding awareness, morality, and presence through the ephemeral yet resonant arc of existence.